Stand with me on Senlac Hill in the grey light before dawn on the 14th of October 1066. Around you men are forming a wall, not stone. Shields, locked edge to edge, a barrier of wood and iron stretching along the ridgeline, and behind it, men who have not slept properly in weeks. Some of them marched here from a battlefield 250 miles north, fought and won a war there, and were given no time to rest before being told to march again. Their legs ache. Their hands gripping axes and spears are raw. And somewhere down the slope in front of them, across open ground, an army that crossed the sea 4 days ago is forming its own lines, rested, prepared, and utterly determined to end 600 years of one people's rule over this island by the time the sun sets. What does it take to end 6 centuries of a kingdom's rule in a single afternoon? If you want the answer, told with the accuracy this day deserves, rather than the legend that's grown up around it, subscribe now. There's more of exactly this waiting for you. To understand why this hillside became the hinge point of English history, you need to go back 9 months, to a death that left a kingdom with no clear answer to the only question that actually mattered: who comes next? Edward the Confessor, King of England, died on the 5th of January 1066. He left no children. He left, in fact, no unambiguous instruction at all about who should follow him, and into that vacuum stepped multiple men, each with a claim, each certain his claim was the legitimate one, and each backed by sources that, conveniently, supported exactly the story that benefited the person telling it. Harold Godwinson was the most powerful nobleman in England, head of the country's most influential family, and the man on the ground when Edward died. English sources tell us that on his deathbed, Edward named Harold as his successor. The Wighton, the Council of English Nobles, accepted this and crowned Harold king the very next day, the 6th of January. From an English perspective, this was as clean and legitimate a succession as the period allowed. Across the Channel, William, Duke of Normandy, told a different story entirely. William claimed Edward had promised him the throne years earlier, back in 1951, during a period when Edward's own position in England had been unstable and Norman support had mattered to him. And William had another card to play, one that has become the most argued over detail of the entire crisis. In 1464, Harold had travelled to Normandy, and while there, had sworn an oath to William. William's version of events holds that Harold swore, freely and knowingly, to support William's claim to the English throne, and that Harold's acceptance of the English crown in January 1066 therefore made him not merely a rival claimant, but an oath-breaker. We need to be precise here, because this single disputed oath became the propaganda foundation for everything that followed, and modern historians do not treat it as settled fact the way Norman chroniclers of the time did. That Harold travelled to Normandy in 1064 and swore some kind of oath appears reasonably well attested. What remains genuinely disputed is the context surrounding it, whether Harold went to Normandy of his own free will or ended up there through circumstances closer to captivity, whether he swore that oath freely or under duress, and whether the entire framing of the trip as something Edward had sanctioned holds up to scrutiny at all. This is not a case of one side telling the truth and the other lying outright. It is 2 political narratives, each shaped by men with every incentive to tell the version of 1064 that served their claim to a crown. And Harold in January 1066 did not have the luxury of dealing with only one rival. William was the threat gathering across the Channel. But there was a second, closer danger as well. Harold's own exiled brother, Tostig, who had allied himself with one of the most feared warriors in Europe, King Harald Hardrada of Norway, and who intended to invade from the north. William, for his part, spent the intervening months building not just an invasion fleet, but a case for legitimacy that extended beyond his own claim. According to the Norman chronicler William of Poitiers, and it is worth flagging clearly that he is the sole contemporary source for this specific claim, Pope Alexander II sanctioned William's invasion, going so far as to provide a papal banner for the campaign, persuaded by William's framing of Harold as an oathbreaker and by William's promise to reform the English church along more modern lines if he won. We tell you this detail because it is often repeated as simple religious sanction for the conquest. It is worth remembering it survives through exactly one source, written by a man employed to celebrate William's reign, describing a claim that conveniently transforms a war of conquest into something closer to a sanctioned crusade. While William gathered ships and blessings, the other threat arrived first. On the 25th of September 1066, Harold's forces met Harold Hardrada and Tostig at Stamford Bridge, in the north of England, and in a battle whose brutality still echoes through the sources, Harold won decisively. Hardrada was killed. Tostig was killed. Most of the invading Norwegian force died with them. It was, by any measure, one of the great victories of Harold's short reign, a defeat inflicted on one of the most formidable warriors of the age. It bought Harold almost nothing. 3 days after Stamford Bridge, William's fleet landed at Pevensey, on England's southern coast. Word reached Harold in the north almost immediately, and the king, who had just fought and won one exhausting battle, now faced the impossible arithmetic of the second. March an army that had already bled and marched hundreds of miles north, turn it around, and cover roughly 240 miles south in under 3 weeks, to face an enemy that had spent those same weeks resting on English soil, fully provisioned, fully rested, and waiting. This was not chaos. This was policy in the coldest sense of that word, William's policy, timed with brutal precision to strike the exact moment his rival's army would be at its most depleted. William had spent the summer of 1066 waiting, his fleet assembled and ready on the Norman coast, held back for weeks by unfavourable winds that Norman chroniclers would later, conveniently, describe as a sign of providence rather than simple weather. Whether that delay was accidental or not, its effect was not. It meant William's crossing coincided almost exactly with the moment Harold's attention and his army were pulled 240 miles away in the opposite direction. Whether by calculation or fortune, William had ensured that whichever version of Harold's army reached the battlefield, it would not be the version that had faced Hardrada at full strength. Harold's forces arrived in the south exhausted, and assembled on a ridge now generally identified with Senlac Hill, roughly 7 miles from the town of Hastings itself, in a formation shaped by necessity as much as strategy. At the centre stood the housecarls, professional, elite soldiers, the closest thing Anglo-Saxon England had to a standing army, armed with the double-handed battle axes that could, in skilled hands, cut through mail and bone in a single stroke. On the wings stood the third, part-time levies, farmers and freemen called up for the campaign, carrying whatever weapons a household could provide, spears and farm tools among them, men with courage but without the training or equipment of the housecarls beside them. Harold's tactical instinct was sound. He positioned his forces on high ground, along a ridge with steep enough approaches that a cavalry charge would lose momentum before it ever reached the shield wall. If he could hold that wall, hour after hour, William's advantage in cavalry and archers would be blunted by geography itself. Across the field, William's force, estimates vary, but the two sides were broadly comparable in size, somewhere in the range of 7,000 to 8,000 men each, combined something Harold's army lacked entirely: organised archers and crossbowmen, and heavy cavalry, knights on horseback, a weapon that had reshaped continental warfare and had no real Anglo-Saxon equivalent on this field. The battle began with William's archers loosing volleys uphill into the shield wall, and then with infantry and cavalry charges against a defensive line that for hours simply refused to break. This is worth pausing on, because it is easy, looking backward from a Norman victory, to imagine this battle as some kind of foregone conclusion. It was not. For the better part of a day, disciplined Anglo-Saxon soldiers held one of the most feared military forces in Europe to a standstill on a hillside, and William's own chroniclers do not pretend otherwise. What broke the shield wall was not a single overwhelming charge. It was discipline meeting a lack of discipline, exploited with real tactical skill. At more than one point in the battle, William's forces staged what modern historians recognize as a deliberate feigned retreat. Cavalry and infantry on his flank pulling back down the slope as though routed, appearing to panic and flee the field. This is a genuinely difficult maneuver to execute convincingly. Soldiers fleeing have to look authentically broken, while retaining enough discipline to wheel, reform and countercharge on command, and getting it wrong means an actual rout rather than a staged one. William's forces pulled it off, and it worked exactly as intended. Portions of Harold's Third, seeing what looked like a genuine Norman collapse, broke formation and charged down the hill in pursuit, abandoning the protection of the shield wall for the chance to cut down a fleeing enemy. It was the single worst decision anyone made that day, and it was not, strictly speaking, a failure of courage. It was a failure of information. Men reading a battlefield correctly, according to everything their experience had taught them, and being wrong because the enemy in front of them was disciplined enough to lie with their own bodies. Once those furred soldiers were exposed on open ground below the ridge, William's cavalry turned back and cut them down in isolated groups, unprotected by the wall that had held for hours. Each time this happened, the English line grew thinner and the gaps grew harder to close. By late afternoon, the wall that had held through hour after hour of assault was fracturing, and somewhere in that fracturing chaos, King Harold Godwinson was killed. How exactly remains one of the most persistent points of dispute in English history, and we owe you the honest version rather than the famous one. If you have any image at all of Harold's death, it is almost certainly this: an arrow, fired from a distance, striking him in the eye, a moment immortalized in the Bayeux Tapestry and repeated in nearly every popular retelling of this battle for generations. Here is what the evidence actually shows. No source written in the years immediately following the battle, not the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, not the Norman chronicler William of Poitiers, not the Carmen de Hastingae Proelio, a poem composed within months of the battle specifically to describe it, mentions an arrow striking Harold at all. The image comes entirely from the Bayeux Tapestry, and even there, the story is far less certain than popular memory suggests. The figure usually identified as Harold clutching something near his face was, in 18th century reproductions of the tapestry, shown holding what appears to be a spear shaft raised above his head, not an arrow embedded in his eye. It was not until an 1818 watercolor reconstruction of the tapestry, made after centuries of wear, and at least one documented restoration, that this figure was rendered holding what we now recognize as an arrow. In other words, the single most famous image of Harold's death may be, at least in part, a 19th century artistic interpretation layered onto a damaged, centuries-old embroidery, not a faithful record of an 11th century eyewitness account. What the earliest and most reliable source, the Carmen de Hastingae Proelio, actually describes is considerably less tidy and considerably more brutal. Harold cut down by several men at once, including William himself, along with Eustace of Boulogne and other named Norman nobles, hacked to death rather than felled by a single arrow from a distance. It is a less clean story than the tapestry's famous image. It also has a far stronger claim to being what actually happened. With Harold dead and his household troops falling around him, what remained of the English resistance collapsed. William's army held the field. The battle that had opened at dawn was by evening decided. If the gap between the legend everyone knows and the evidence that actually survives fascinates you as much as it fascinates us, our members get this kind of deeper correction across every battle we cover, first and in full. It's there whenever you're ready to go further with us. It is worth pausing, too, on why this particular combination of forces produced the result it did, because the imbalance was not simply a matter of one side being braver or better led. William's army represented something close to the cutting edge of continental warfare in this period. Mounted knights trained to charge, wheel, and charge again as a coordinated unit, supported by archers capable of raining sustained volleys into a static position from a distance. All of it organized under commanders experienced in exactly this kind of combined arms assault. Harold's third, by contrast, were not full-time soldiers at all. Many were farmers and freemen who owed a set period of military service to their lord, and who fought, when they fought, with whatever their household could arm them with. A spear, an axe meant for splitting wood as easily as splitting a skull, sometimes little more than a reinforced hunting bow. Only the housecarls at the centre of Harold's line matched Norman professionalism blow for blow, and it is telling that the line held for as long as it did specifically where those professional soldiers stood, and began to fail first on the wings, where the Ferd's courage was never in question, but their training simply was. William did not simply walk into a crown after Hastings. Even with the English king dead and his household troops broken, London and the surviving English nobility did not simply open their gates. William spent the weeks after the battle securing key strongholds, cutting a deliberate path toward the capital rather than marching on it directly, burning and threatening enough of the surrounding countryside to make the cost of continued resistance clear, without yet needing to storm the city itself. It worked. The remaining English nobles who might have rallied behind a new claimant instead came to William and submitted, and he was finally crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day, 1066, less than 3 months after landing at Pevensey. The years that followed his coronation were not peaceful. Resistance to Norman rule continued in pockets across the kingdom, and William's response to that resistance, particularly a brutal, scorched earth campaign of pacification across the north of England in the years that followed, would eventually become its own brutal chapter of this story, one severe enough that it deserves, and will get, its own full telling rather than a rushed mention here at the end of this one. Casualty figures for the battle itself remain difficult to pin down with any real precision, the way most medieval battle counts do. Modern historians working from the available evidence commonly suggest a rough estimate of around 2,000 Norman dead, with English losses running to roughly twice that figure. These are estimates, not a census, and we present them as such. So what actually happened on this hillside, stripped of arrows in eyes and clean narratives of righteous conquest? Two men, each backed by a story that served his own claim to a crown a dead king left ambiguous, fought for a kingdom neither had an uncontested right to. One of them had already won an exhausting battle in the north days before, and marched his depleted army the length of the country to fight a second. The other had rested, planned his timing with precision, and secured through a single self-interested chronicler's account the appearance of holy sanction for what was, underneath the banner, a war of conquest like any other. A shield wall held for most of a day against everything thrown at it, and broke not through weakness, but through a lie told convincingly enough on a battlefield to make brave men abandon the one thing keeping them alive. By nightfall, 600 years of Anglo-Saxon rule over England had ended, decided not by inevitability, but by an oath whose truth we still cannot verify, a march that left one army too exhausted to fully recover, and a retreat that was never real at all. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the myths corrected, the disputed claims weighed honestly, the human decisions behind the dates everyone thinks they already know, there's another one waiting for you. Click it, and walk with us further into